go. Chapter 30, the 26th of November. Oh, that's the day Walter's supposed to be able to stop dressing like a dude. We'll see what's going on. As soon as the first gleam of morning penetrated through the curtains of the boudoir in the villa near Upper Clapton, Walter leapt from her couch. Conflicting feelings of joy and sorrow filled her bosom. The happy day had at length arrived, when, according to the promise of the man on whom she looked as her benefactor, a grand event was to be accomplished, which would release her from the detestable disguise which she had now maintained for a period of nearly 5 years. The era had come when she was again to appear in the garb that suited alike her charms and her inclinations. This circumstance inspired her with the most heartfelt happiness. But, on the other hand, she tenderly loved one who had meditated against her an outrage of a most infamous description. Instead of hailing her approaching return to her female attire as the signal for the consummation of the fond hopes in which she had a few weeks before indulged, hopes which pictured her imagination delicious scenes of matrimonial bliss in the society of George Montague, she was compelled to separate the dream of felicity from the feat of her emancipation, from a thraldom repulsive to her delicacy and her tastes. It was therefore with mingled feelings of happiness and melancholy that she commenced her usual toilette, that masculine toilette which she was that day to wear for the last time. "You ought to be in good spirits this morning, my dearest mistress," said Louisa as she entered the room. "The period so anxiously looked forward to by you has at length arrived." "And tomorrow," exclaimed Walter, her hazel eyes lighting up with a brilliant expression of joy, "you, my excellent Louisa, will assist me to adorn myself with that garb which I have neglected so of late." "I shall be happy both for your sake and mine," returned Louisa, who was indeed deeply attached to her mistress. "And when I see you recovering all your usual spirits in a foreign land—" "In Switzerland," hastily interrupted Walter. "In Switzerland, whither you will accompany me, my good and faithful Louisa, and to which delightful country we will proceed without delay. There, indeed, I shall be happy, and I hope contented." "Mr. Stevens is to be here at 10, is he not?" said Louisa, after a short pause. "At 10 precisely, and then we repair forthwith to the west end of the town, where certain preliminaries are requisite, previously to receiving an immense sum of money which we will be paid at the Bank of England. This much Mr. Stevens told me yesterday. He had never communicated so much before." "And this very afternoon it is your determination to leave London," said Louisa. "I am now resolved upon that step," replied the lady. "You alone shall accompany me. Mr. Stevens has promised to provide for the groom and the old cook. Therefore, while I am absent this morning about the momentous business, the real nature of which, by the by, has yet to be explained to me, you will make all the preparations that may be necessary for our journey." I have a feeling this isn't going to go as smoothly as Walter thinks. This conversation took place while Louisa hastily lighted the fire in the boudoir. In a few minutes the grate sent up a cheering and grateful heat, and the flames roared up the chimney. The lady, with an elegant dressing gown folded loosely around her and her delicate white feet thrust into red morocco slippers, threw herself into her luxurious easy-chair, while Louisa hastened to serve up breakfast upon a little rosewood table, covered with a napkin as white as snow. But the meal passed away almost untouched. The lady's heart was too full of hope and tender melancholy to allow her to experience the least appetite. The mysterious toilette was completed, and Walter descended to the parlor attired in masculine garments for the last time. At 10 o'clock precisely, Mr. Stevens arrived. He was dressed with peculiar neatness and care, but his countenance was very pale, and his eyes vibrated in a restless manner in their sockets. He, however, assumed a bold composure, and thus the profound anxiety to which he was at that moment prey was unnoticed by Walter Sidney. They seated themselves upon the sofa and looked at each other for an instant without speaking. Those glances on either side expressed in the ardent language of the eyes the words, "This is the day." "Walter," said Mr. Stevens, at length breaking the silence which had prevailed, "your conduct today must crown my designs in glorious success, or involve me in irretrievable ruin." "You may rely with confidence upon my discretion and prudence," answered Walter. "Command me in all respects consistently with honor." Honor, exclaimed Stevens impatiently. Why do you forever mention that unmeaning word? Honor is a conventional term, and is often used in a manner inconsistently with common sense and sound judgment. Honor is all very well when it is brought in contact with honor only, but when it has to oppose fraud and deceit, it must succumb if it trusts solely to its own force. This doesn't sound good. The most honest lawyer sets chicanery and quibble to work to counteract the chicanery and quibble of his pettifogging opponent. Man, there's some tongue twisters in this chapter. The politician calls the machinery of intrigue into play in order to fight his foeman with that foeman's own weapon. If the French employ the aid of riflemen concealed in the thicket while the fair fight take place upon the plain, the English must do the same. I certainly comprehend the necessity of frequently fighting a man with his own weapons, said Walter, but I do not see to what point in our affairs your reasoning tends. Suppose, Walter, resumed Stevens, speaking very earnestly and emphatically, accentuating every syllable, suppose that you had a friend who was entitled to certain rights which were withheld from him by means of some detestable quibble and low chicanery. Suppose that by stating that your friend's name was George instead of William, for instance, you could put him in possession of what is justly and legitimately his due, but which, remember, is shamefully and most dishonestly kept away from him. In this case, should you hesitate to declare that his name was George and not William? I think I should be inclined to make the statement to serve the cause of justice and to render a friend a signal service, answered Sidney after a moment's hesitation. I could not have expected a different reply, exclaimed Stevens, a gleam of joy animating his pale countenance. And you would do so with less remorse when you found that you were transferring property from one individual, who could well spare what he was never justly entitled to a person who would starve without the restoration of his legitimate rights. Oh, certainly, said Walter, and this time the reply was given without an instant's meditation. Then, continued Stevens, more and more satisfied with the influence of his sophistry, you would in such a case eschew those maudlin and mawkish ideas of honor, which arbitrarily exact that a falsehood must never be told for a good purpose, and that illegitimate means must never, never be adopted to work out virtuous and profitable ends? My conduct in assuming this disguise, returned Sidney with a smile and a blush, has proved to you, I should imagine, that I should not hesitate to make use of a deceit comparatively innocent, with a view to oppose fraud and ensure permanent benefit to my friend and myself. Oh, Walter, you should have been a man in person as well as in mind, cried Stevens enthusiastically. Now I have no fears of the result of my plans, and before sunset you shall be worth 10,000 pounds. 10,000 pounds, repeated Walter mechanically. How much can be done with such a sum as that? You expressed a wish to leave this country and visit the south of Europe, said Stevens. You will have ample means to gratify all your tastes and administer to all your inclinations. Only conceive a beautiful little cottage on the shore of the Lake of Brienz, that pearl of the Oberland, the fair boatwomen, the daughters of Switzerland, passing in their little shallops beneath your windows, and singing their national songs full of charming tenderness, while the soft music mingles with the murmuring waves and the sound of the oars. Oh, what an enchanting picture, cried Walter, and have you ever seen such as this? I have, and I feel convinced that the existence I recommend is the one which will best suit you. Today, continued Stevens, watching his compatriot's countenance with a little anxiety, shall you recover your rights. Today shall you oppose the innocent deceit to the enormous fraud. Today shall you do for yourself what you ere now stated you would do for a friend. If you have drawn my own case in putting those queries to me, if immense advantage will be derived from my behavior in this affair, if I am merely wresting from the hands of base cupidity that which is justly my own, and if the enemy whom we oppose can well afford to restore to me the means of subsistence, and thus render me independent for the remainder of my days, oh, how can I hesitate for a moment? How can I refuse to entrust myself wholly and solely, blindly and confidently in your hands, you who have done so much for me, and who have taught me to respect, honor, and obey you? The lady uttered these words with a species of electric enthusiasm, while her eyes brightened and her cheeks were suffused with the purple glow of animation. The specious arguments and the glowing description of Swiss life brought forward by Stevens with admirable dexterity awakened all the ardor of an impassioned soul, and the bosom of that beauteous creature palpitated with hope, with joy, and with excitement, as she gazed upon the future through the mirror presented by Stevens to her view. She was now exactly in a frame of mind suited to his purpose. without allowing her ardor time to abate, and while she was animated by the delicious aspirations which he had conjured up, as it were, by an enchanter's spell, he took her by the hand and led her up to the mantelpiece. Then, pointing to the portrait of her brother, he said in a slow, hurried, and yet solemn tone, "The fortune which must be wrested from the grasp of cupidity this day would have belonged to your brother, and no power on earth could have deprived him of it, for had he lived, he would yesterday have attained his 21st year. His death is unknown to him who holds this money, yet by a miserable legal technicality, you, his sister, and in justice his heiress, you would be deprived of that fortune by the man who now grasps it, and who would chuckle at any plan which made it his own. Now do you comprehend me? You have but to say that your name is Walter instead of Eliza, and you will recover your just rights, defeat the wretched chicanery of the law, and enter into possession of those resources which belong to you in the eyes of God, by which, if you shrink, will be forever alienated from you and yours." I thought maybe she was pretending to be her brother. Interesting. "In one word," said the lady, "I am to impersonate my brother." "Precisely. Do you hesitate?" demanded Stevens. "Will you allow the property of your family to pass into the hands of a stranger, who possesses not the remotest right to its enjoyment? Or will you, by one bold effort, an effort that cannot fail, direct that fortune into its just, its proper, and its legitimate channel?" "The temptation is great," said the lady, earnestly contemplating the portrait of her brother. "But the danger, she added hastily. "What would be the result if we were detected?" Nothing save the total loss of the entire fortune," answered Stevens, "and therefore you perceive that want of nerve, hesitation, awkwardness, blushes, confusion on your part would ruin all. Be firm, be collected, be calm and resolute, and our plans must be crowned with unequivocal success. Except the post office knows, and George Montague knows, and I don't trust him. Oh, if I proceed farther, I will pass through the ordeal with ease and safety," exclaimed the lady. "I can nerve my mind to encounter any danger when it is well defined and I know its extent. It is only when it is vague, uncertain, and indistinct that I shrink from meeting it. Yes," she continued, after a few moments' reflection, "I will follow your counsel in all respects. You must know how much we risk and how far we compromise ourselves. And when I see you ready to urge on this matter to the end, how can I fear to accompany you? Yes," she added after another pause, much longer than the preceding one, "I will be Walter Sidney throughout this day at least." "My dear friend," said Stevens in a transport of joy, "you act in a manner worthy of your noble-hearted brother. I see, he smiles upon you even in his picture frame." "I will retrieve from the hands of strangers that which is thine, dear brother," said the lady, addressing herself to the portrait, as if it could hear the words which she pronounced with a melancholy solemnity. Then, turning towards Stevens, she exclaimed, "But you must acquaint me with the ceremonies we have to fulfill, and the duties which I shall have to perform in order to accomplish the desired aim." "I need not instruct you now," returned Stevens. "The forms are nothing, and explain themselves, as it were. A few papers to sign at a certain person's house, then a ride to the bank, and all is over. But we must now take our departure. The hackney coach that brought us hither is waiting to convey us to the West End." Sidney and Stevens issued from the house together. The former gave certain directions to the coachman, and they then commenced their memorable journey. Mr. Stevens did not allow his companion a single moment for calm and dispassionate reflection. He continued to expound upon the happiness which was within her reach amidst the rural scenery of Switzerland. He conjured up before her mental vision the most ravishing and delightful pictures of domestic tranquility, so congenial to her tastes. He fed her imagination with all those fairy visions which were calculated to attract and dazzle a mind tinged with the romantic shade. And then he skillfully introduced those specious arguments which blinded her as to the real nature of the deceit in which she was so prominent an agent. He thus sustained an artificial state of excitement bordering upon enthusiasm in the bosom of that confiding and generous-hearted woman, and not for one moment during that long ride did she repent of the steps she had taken. In fact, such an influence did the reasoning of Stevens exercise upon her mind that she ceased to think of the possibility of either incurring danger or doing wrong. She knew not how serious might be the consequences of detection. She believed that she was combating the chicanery of the law with a similar weapon, the use of which was justified and rendered legitimate by the peculiar circumstances of the case. Oh, she's in a lot of trouble. The hackney coach proceeded by way of the New Road and stopped to take up Mr. McChisel at his residence near St. Pancras New Church. The vehicle then proceeded to Grosvenor Square, where it stopped opposite one of those princely dwellings whose dingy exteriors afford to the eye of the foreigner accustomed to the gorgeous edifices of continental cities but little promise of the wealth, grandeur, and magnificence which exist within. The door was opened by a footman in splendid livery. This domestic immediately recognized Mr. Stevens and said, "His lordship expects you, sir." The three visitors alighted from the coach, and as Stevens walked with the disguised lady into the hall of the mansion, he said in a hurried whisper, "Courage, my dear Walter. You are now about to appear in the presence of the Earl of Warrington." It's coming full circle. We knew he was going to show up again. This is the guy that Diana has thrown her lot in with. The servant led the way up a wide staircase and conducted the visitors into a library fitted up in the most luxurious and costly manner. Cases filled with magnificently bound volumes, statues of exquisite sculpture, and pictures of eminent artists denoted the taste of the aristocratic possessor of that lordly mansion. Two individuals were seated at a table covered with papers and legal documents. One was a fine, tall, middle-aged man with a noble and handsome countenance, polished manners, and most kind and affable address. The other was an old gentleman with a bald head, sharp features, and constant smile upon his lips when he addressed the personage just described. The first was the Earl of Warrington. The other was his solicitor, Mr. Pakenham. The Earl rose and greeted Mr. Stevens cordially. Then, turning toward Walter, he shook her kindly by the hand and said, "I need not ask if you are the young gentleman to whom I am to be introduced as Mr. Walter Sidney." "This is my ward, your lordship," said Mr. Stevens, smiling. "I think it is scarcely necessary to call your lordship's attention to the striking resemblance which he bears to his lamented father." "Yes, it would be impossible to mistake him," said his lordship hastily, while a cloud passed over his brow. "But sit down, pray sit down, and we will proceed to business. I presume that gentleman is your professional adviser?" "Mr. McChisel," observed Stevens, introducing the lawyer. "Mr. Pakenham, I have had the pleasure of seeing you before," he added, addressing the nobleman's attorney with a placid smile. Mr. Pakenham acknowledged the salutation with a bow, and his eye wandered for a moment with some surprise toward McChisel, as much as to say, "I am astonished to see a person like you employed in so important an affair." When everyone was seated, the Earl of Warrington referred to some papers placed before him and said, "The object of this meeting is known to everyone present. The duty that devolves upon me is to transfer to Walter Sidney, the only son and heir of the late Stanford Sidney, upon being satisfied with respect to the identity of the claimant, the sum of £41,000 now invested in certain stocks in the Bank of England." "It is needless, I presume," said Mr. Pakenham, "to enter into the particulars of this inheritance. We on our side admit our liability to pay the amount specified by his lordship to the proper claimant." "Quite satisfactory," observed McChisel, to whom these observations were addressed. "The proofs of identity are, then, all that your lordship now requires?" said Mr. Stevens. "And I only require them as a mere matter of necessary form and ceremony, Mr. Stevens," returned the Earl of Warrington. "I am well aware of your acquaintance with the late Mrs. Sidney, and of the fact that the deceased lady left her children to your care." "My lord, here are the various certificates," said Stevens, placing a small packet of papers before the Earl. "In the first instance, you have the marriage certificate of Stanford Sidney and Letitia Hardinge, the natural daughter of the late Earl of Warrington, your lordship's uncle." "Interesting. Well, well," exclaimed the nobleman, somewhat impatiently, as if he were anxious to get rid as soon as possible of a business by no means pleasant to him. "That certificate is beyond all dispute." "Here," continued Stevens, "is the certificate of the birth of Eliza Sidney, born October 12th, 1810, and here is the certificate of her death, which took place on the 14th of February, 1831. "This certificate is not necessary," observed Mr. Pakenham, as in no case under the provisions of these deeds," he added, pointing to a pile of documents before him, "could that young lady have instituted even a shadow of a claim to this money." "We had better possess one deed too many than one too few," said Mr. Stevens, with another bland smile. "Oh, certainly," exclaimed the Earl, "and this precaution shows the exact condition of the late Mr. Stanford Sidney's family. The daughter is no more, the son lives and is present." Interesting. So this was actually very common, that girls could not inherit daughters couldn't inherit their father's fortunes. So that's what they're basically saying, is it doesn't matter what happened to Eliza because she never could have inherited anyway. So interesting. "Here then, my lord," continued Stevens, is the certificate of the birth of Walter Sidney on the 25th day of November, 1814. The nobleman examined this document with far more attention than he had devoted to either of the former. He then handed it to Mr. Pakenham, who also scrutinized it narrowly. "It is quite correct, my lord," said this gentleman. "We now require 2 witnesses as to identity." "I presume his lordship will receive me as one," observed Mr. Stevens, "considering my intimate acquaintance with all—" "Oh, certainly, certainly," interrupted the Earl hastily. "And Mr. McChisel will tender his evidence in the other instance," said Stevens. "I have known this young gentleman for the last 6 years," exclaimed McChisel, pointing towards Walter, "and I knew his mother also." "Is your lordship satisfied?" inquired Mr. Pakenham after a short pause. "Perfectly," said the nobleman without hesitation. "I am, however, in your hands." "Oh, as for me," returned Mr. Pakenham, "I have no objection to offer. Your lordship is acquainted with Mr. Stevens." "Yes, yes," again interrupted the Earl. "I have known Mr. Stevens for some years, and I know him to be a man of honor." "Then there is nothing more to be said," observed Pakenham. "No, nothing," added McChisel, "but to complete the business." "I will now read the release," said Mr. Pakenham. The solicitor settled himself in a comfortable manner in his chair, taking up a deed consisting of several folios, proceeded to make his hearers as much acquainted with its contents as the multifarious redundancies of law terms would allow. The disguised lady had now time for reflection. She had been more or less prepared for the assertion of Mr. Stevens that Eliza Sidney was dead, and that Walter was living, but the barefaced falsehood uttered by McChisel, who, so far from having been acquainted with her for years, had never seen her until that morning, shocked and astounded her. She had also just learnt for the first time that her late mother was the natural daughter of an earl, and she perceived that she herself could claim a distant kinship with the nobleman in whose presence she then was. This circumstance inspired her with feelings in his favor, which were enhanced by the urbanity of his manners and the readiness with which he admitted all the proofs submitted to him by Mr. Stevens. She had expected, from the arguments used by this gentleman to convince her that she should not hesitate to fight the law with its own weapons, that every obstacle would be thrown in the way of her claims by him on whom they were to be made. And she was astonished when she compared all the specious representations of Stevens with the readiness, goodwill, and alacrity manifested by the Earl in yielding up an enormous sum of money. Now also, for the first time, it struck her as remarkable that Stevens had promised her £10,000, only a 4th part of that amount to which, according to his own showing, she alone was justly entitled. All these reflections passed rapidly through her mind while the lawyer was reading the deed of release, not one word of which was attended to by her. She suddenly felt as if her eyes were open to a fearful conspiracy in which she was playing a conspicuous part. She trembled as if she were standing upon the edge of a precipice, and yet she knew not how to act. She was bewildered, but the uppermost idea in her mind was that she had gone too far to retreat. This was the impression that ruled her thoughts at the precise moment when Mr. Pakenham brought the reading of the long and wearisome document to a termination. The buzzing, droning noise which had filled her ears for upwards of 20 minutes suddenly ceased, and she heard a voice say in a kind tone, "Will you now please sign this?" She started, but immediately recovered her presence of mind, and taking the pen from the lawyer's hand, applied the signature of Walter Sidney to the document. It was next witnessed by Pakenham, Stevens, and McChisel, who handed it to the Earl. The nobleman then took several papers, familiar to all those who have ever possessed bank stock, from an iron safe in one corner of the library, and handed them to the disguised lady, said, "Mr. Walter Sidney, I have much pleasure in putting you in possession of this fortune, and I can assure you that my very best wishes for your health and prosperity accompany the transfer." Walter received the documents mechanically, as it were, and murmured a few words of thanks and gratitude. "Perhaps, Mr. Stevens," said the Earl, when the ceremony was thus completed, "you and your friends will do me the honor to accept of a slight refreshment in an adjoining room. You will excuse my absence, but I have a few matters of pressing importance to transact with my solicitor, which cannot possibly be postponed. You must accept this as my apology, and believe in my regret that I cannot keep you company." The Earl shook hands with both Stevens and Sidney, and bowed to McChisel. These 3 individuals then withdrew. I'm worried. I mean, they made it through the reading and the signing of everything, but that can't possibly be the end of this, because these stories are way too complicated for that. An elegant collation was prepared for them in another apartment, but McChisel was the only one who seemed inclined to pay his respects to it. Walter, however, gladly swallowed a glass of wine, for she felt exhausted with the excitement she had passed through. Stevens was too highly elated either to eat or drink, and too anxious to complete the business in the city, to allow McChisel to waste much time over the delicacies of which the collation consisted. They were therefore all 3 soon on their way to the Bank of England. Well, I think we managed the job very correctly, said McChisel. Everything passed off precisely as I had anticipated, observed Mr. Stevens. But you, Walter, you are serious. I do not look upon the transaction in the same light as I did a couple of hours since, she answered coldly. Oh, my dear friend, cried Stevens, you are deceived by the apparent urbanity of that nobleman and the mildness of his solicitor. They assumed that appearance because there was no help for them. They had no good to gain by throwing obstacles in our way. But the certificate of my death was a forgery, said Walter bitterly. A necessary alteration of names, without which the accomplishment of our plan would have been impossible, answered Stevens. But let me ease your mind in one respect, my dear Walter. That nobleman is a relation of yours, and yet until this day his name has never been mentioned to you. And why? Because he visits upon you the hatred which he entertained for your deceased mother. Did you not observe that he interrupted me when I spoke of her? Did you not notice that he touched with extreme aversion upon the topics which connected with your revered parents? I did, exclaimed Walter. He hates you, he detests you, continued Stevens emphatically, and he will not countenance any claim which you might advance towards kinship with him. His duties as a nobleman and a gentleman dictated the outward civility with which he treated you, but his heart gave not the words of congratulations which issued from his lips. I believe you. I know that you are speaking the truth, cried Walter. Pardon me if for a moment I cease to look upon you as a friend. Walter, he's tricking you. Stevens pressed the hand of the too confiding being over whom his dangerous eloquence and subtle reasoning possessed an influence so omnipotent for purposes of evil, and he then again launched out into glowing descriptions of the sources and means of happiness within her reach. This reasoning, aided by the hope that in a few hours she would be enabled to quit London forever, restored the lady's disposition to that same easy and pliant state, to which Stevens had devoted nearly 5 years to model it. At length the hackney coach stopped at the Bank of England. Stevens hurried to the rotunda to obtain the assistance of a stockbroker for the purpose of transferring and selling out the immense sum which now appeared within his reach, and to obtain which he had devoted his time, his money, and his tranquility. Now remember, the people at the post office warned the people at the Bank of England about this, so I have a feeling this is where it's all going to fall apart. Walter and the lawyer awaited his return beneath the porch of the entrance. After the lapse of a few moments, he appeared, accompanied by a broker of his acquaintance. They then all four proceeded together to the office where the business was to be transacted. The broker explained the affair to a clerk, and the clerk, after consulting a huge volume, received the documents which Lord Warrington had handed over to Sidney. Having compared those papers with the entries in the book, the clerk made a sign to 3 men who were lounging at the upper end of the office, near the stove, and who had the appearance of messengers or porters. These men moved hastily forward and advanced up to Stevens, McChisel, and Walter Sidney. A deadly pallor spread over the countenance of Stevens. McChisel appeared alarmed, but Walter remained still unsuspicious of the danger. Those are the persons, said the clerk significantly as he pointed to the 3 conspirators to whom he observed, almost in the same breath, your plans are detected. These men are officers. Officers, said Sidney. What does this mean? We are here to apprehend you, answered the foremost of these functionaries. Resistance will be vain. There are others outside in readiness. Merciful heavens, cried Walter, joining her hands in agony. Oh, Stevens, what have you brought me? That unhappy man hung down his head and made no reply. He felt crushed by this unexpected blow, which came upon him at the very instant when the object of his dearest hopes seems within his reach. As for McChisel, he resigned himself with dogged submission to his fate. The officers and their prisoners now proceeded to the mansion house, accompanied by the clerk and the stockbroker. Sidney, a prey to the most dreadful apprehensions and painful remorse, was compelled to lean for support upon the arm of the officer who had charge of her. Sir Peter Lorry sat for the Lord Mayor. The worthy knight is the terror of all swindlers, mock companies, and bubble firms existing in the city of London. Wherever there is fraud within the jurisdictions of the civic authorities, he is certain to root it out. He has conferred more benefit upon the commercial world and has devoted himself more energetically to protect the interests at the trading community than any other alderman. Unlike the generality of the city magistrates, who are coarse, vulgar, ignorant, and narrow-minded men, Sir Peter Lorry is possessed of a high range of intellect and is an enlightened and agreeable and a polished gentleman. It was about 3 o'clock in the afternoon when Stevens, McChisel, and Sidney were placed in the dock of the Mansion House police office. The solicitor of the Bank of England attended for the prosecution. With what do you charge these prisoners? Demanded the magistrate. With conspiring to obtain a sum of £41,000 from the hands of the Earl of Warrington and the Governor and Company of the Bank of England. Is his lordship present? Your worship, he is at this moment unaware of the diabolical fraud which has been contemplated and in part perpetrated upon him. He has given up to the prisoners certain documents which constitute their authority for transferring and selling out the sum I have mentioned. By certain means, the intentions of the prisoners were discovered some time ago, and secret information was given to the bank directors upon the subject. The directors were not, however, permitted to communicate with the Earl of Warrington, under penalty of receiving no further information from the quarter whence the original warning emanated. Under all circumstances, I shall content myself with stating sufficient to support the charge today, so that your worship may remand the prisoners until a period when the attendance of the Earl of Warrington can be procured. State your case. Oh boy, here we go. I charge this prisoner, said the solicitor, pointing towards Sidney, with endeavouring to obtain the sum of £41,000 from the Governor and Company of the Bank of England, under the pretence of being Walter Sidney, a man, whereas the prisoner's name is Eliza Sidney, and she is a woman. An immense sensation prevailed in the justice room at this announcement. The disguised lady moaned audibly and leant against the bar of the dock for support. And I charged the other prisoners, Robert Stevens and Hugh McChisel, with aiding and abetting in the crime, added the solicitor after a pause. Oh, so it's even being presented as if she's the one who created the whole thing and the others are just helping her. Oh, she's in so much trouble. Walter! The unhappy lady, yielding to emotions and feelings which she was now no longer able to control, threw herself upon her knees, clasped her hands together in agony and grief, and exclaimed, "It is true. I am not what I seem. I have been guilty of a fearful deception, a horrible cheat, but it is he, she cried, pointing to Stevens, who made me do it." There was a universal sentiment of deep sympathy with the female prisoner throughout the court, and the worthy alderman himself was affected. "You must remember," he said in a kind tone, "that anything which you admit here may be used against you elsewhere." "I am anxious to confess all that I have done and all that I know," cried the lady, "and in so doing I shall in some measure atone for the enormity of my guilt, which I now view in its true light." "Under these circumstances," said the alderman, "let the case stand over until tomorrow." The prisoners were then removed. In another hour they were inmates at the Giltspur Street Compter. And how terminated the 26th of November for Walter Sidney? Instead of being in possession of an ample fortune and about to visit a clime where she hoped to enjoy all the blessings of domestic tranquility and the charms of rural bliss, she found herself a prisoner, charged with a crime of deep dye. Oh, what sudden reverse was this! Still, upon that eventful day there was one hope of hers fulfilled. She threw aside her masculine attire and assumed the garb adapted to her sex. A messenger was dispatched to the villa to communicate the sad tidings of the arrest to Louisa and procure suitable clothing for her wretched mistress. But alas, the garb in which she had so ardently desired to appear again was now doomed to be worn for the first time in a prison. The new epoch of her life, which was to be marked by a return to feminine habits, was commenced in a dungeon. Still, that new period had begun, and from henceforth we shall know her only by her real name, Eliza Sidney. Eliza! So now I'm worried about Richard, and I'm worried about Eliza, and I'm worried about Bob's children, and I'm worried about a lot of people. So, okay, we'll see how this goes.